Yes.
Dr. Rejman, so this is still within the context of the HCV litigation,
Yes.
but I'm not asking you about the details of the litigation. Could we go to WITN 5426048? No, WITN 5426048. That's page 48 of 001. So this is a minute you wrote to Mrs. James, that's Anita James in the Solicitors Department, 28th of September 1995. Now, just to put it in context, but I'm not asking about the bigger picture, I'm just going to ask you about one paragraph. There'd been advice from Council to the Department of Health about whether blood fell within the Consumer Protection Act. You weren't convinced by Council's advice. You raised some views about you thought it might be wrong and so on. I'm not going to ask you about the substance of that at all, but we've got the contemporaneous documents. I just wanted to ask you about what you say in paragraph 5 on this page. Having expressed your views about the advice that had been given and your disagreement with it, you said we shouldn't ask Council to do any further work. I'd fully support Council's view that any request to go outside to specialists such as Professor Ian Kennedy and others poses a very major risk of our inquiries becoming public, which could well prejudice ministers' freedom of action. And then the minute goes on to, again, discuss aspects of the advice and issues relating to, I think, the campaign for compensation. It's just that paragraph 5. Why were you concerned that the department's consideration of this rather important issue about blood products and whether they were covered by the blood and whether it was covered by the Consumer Protection Act should become public?
I presume I would have discussed this with, although John Canavan isn't on the copyright, Mr. Pudler, this is
yes.
After Mr. Pudler had taken on board. I suspect that I would have discussed this with Mr. Pudlow because after all it was more of an administrative matter than obviously one for me. Basically Council had said that at the present time, when nothing really is happening, then, and what I'm saying there basically is that, you know, I've had this, my view and Council's view were not quite the same, but having said that, I didn't think there was any point in Council doing any more work on it because the litigation seemed to have come to a, well, not to a stop, but basically it wasn't progressing, put it like that. And therefore I thought, well, Council really shouldn't be wasting his time doing this until such time as we knew that something was going to happen with the litigation. And then the second bit about Council, it's Council's view, not mine, that if you go outside, then there's a risk of it going public. Now, Professor Ian Kennedy obviously is a very well-known figure and presumably was at that time. And presumably it was a possibility that if he or somebody else was asked something, then, you know, it would get into the press and in a sense, you see, it's a case of if it's not necessary, why take a risk of things causing difficulties?
My question was a slightly different one, Dr. Rejman. It's more, what's the problem if things become public? Why is that something to fear or try to avoid?
Well, it's said there that it might prejudice ministers' freedom of action. Now, you don't want to be in a position where somebody says something about something and that affects what a minister can or cannot do, particularly if there's some sort of suggestion that the person whose advice has been sought is actually linked to the department. because I think this goes back to the question of confidentiality and ACVSB. Basically, it's the case that if people know something, and particularly, and if whatever they know, it's suggested that that is something that is being advised to Minister, then Minister may be in a difficult position, particularly in the House, because MPs may say to him, look, you've been given this advice and why aren't you following it? And I suspect, without knowing all the detail, reading this today, that would be my interpretation.
On a similar theme, but relating to different materials, could we go to WITN 5426007? This is a minute from you, 7th of March 1995,
Yes.
To Mr Blake and the Solicitors Department. It's in response to a letter that had been received by you from Dr Colvin about whether documents relating to UK HCDO minutes should go to Professor Hardesty in relation to some Irish litigation. I'm not asking you about the detail of that. It's the observation at paragraph 5. So you talk through that and you ask for advice on how to reply to Dr Colvin's letter. And then at paragraph 5 you say this: among the papers will be a significant amount of discussion regarding non-A, non-B, hepatitis C, which we might not wish to have in the public domain at the present time or in the near future. What was it about the documentation relating to non-A, non-B hepatitis that you thought it might be disadvantageous to the department to have in the public domain?
Well, obviously, there are two things with this particular minute. It's not clear precisely which minutes in fact, it's the commercial I think it's the commercial manufacturers who provided factor rate in Ireland. I think that's my reading, that they wanted these minutes to be available so that they could use them in their defence in Ireland. But it doesn't actually say, well, it says minutes and their AIDS group. Now, is it only the AIDS group minutes or is it all their minutes? And I think I'm asking Mr Blake, how do I reply to this letter? And secondly, by the way, there was discussion of non-A, non-B at various times at the UK HCDO, and because currently we're in the situation of litigation here, start with writs being issued here against DH, would it be best for that sort of information not to go out? Because, see, these minutes are supposed to be confidential. This is the point that I think is important. These minutes of the UK HCDO were not actually publicly available. They were actually confidential minutes, and as such, that was the reason why they were asking for them. Because if they were in the public domain, then there'd be no question about them. They could have just got them, no problem. But these minutes were confidential to the directors. Now, I don't know, I cannot remember at this period of time exactly what my concerns were about it, but I suspect that it was linked in to the writs that had been issued or were about to be issued against DH.
I'm going to ask you now, as my final main topic of questions, about issues relating to the destruction or loss of documents.
Yes.
So some of the matters you explored in your first statement
Yes.
to the inquiry and also to some extent in your second statement
Yes.
to the inquiry. Before I look at a handful of the documents with you, when you were at the department, so from 89 through to 97, 98, as far as you can recall, what were the systems in place for the storage and retention of documents that might be relevant to risks of infection from blood or blood products?
I had no idea because it was not part of my work and I never came across it.
You've been provided with a copy of a statement from Anita James.
Yes.
Detailed statement, don't need to ask you about most of it. But she set out in part of her statement, and I'll just give the reference. I don't think we need to have it on screen, but let me know if you disagree. It's WITN 5426001, paragraph 4.108. She set out an understanding that policy files generally had a 20-year destruction date. Was that your understanding, or was that not something you had any knowledge of?
I had no knowledge of it. I think at the time when I was looking at the papers for my first statement, I became aware that 5 years was the standard time frame at which papers were to be reviewed, and that was actually shown up on the dockets that were included in those particular ACVSB files, where it had a review date which was 5 years after the final date of that particular volume.
Now, in 1995, you were asked, I think pursuant to a request from Mr. Schofield, but also a request from Mrs. James, to identify relevant documents relating to the decision-making process regarding hepatitis C screening.
Yes.
And again, you've referred to those documents. I'm just going to read a couple of references into the transcript, but I don't think we need to look at it. So WITN 4486997, WITN 4486008. No, sorry, that's the wrong reference, the first one. It should be 4486007, I think, 008, and WITN 4486009 and 10. So that happens in the spring of 1995. And then if we can just look at a document you provided in, a minute you provided in response to one of those requests. So, Paul, if we can have on screen, WITN 4486011. So on the 19th of May, you wrote to Mrs. James as a brief note to bring her up to date on how far you'd got with the process. You say you've gone through all your files and am now partway through the official files held by Mr. Burridge. This first phase of the discovery is limited to the period 1890-91, so the relevance of which is obviously apparent. And then you say, so far I've listed approximately 600 documents, and I hope to have completed this part of the exercise by the end of next week or early the following week. And then before I ask you a question, if we can then look at WITN 4486012. Can we go to the second page of this, first of all? So this is some handwritten notes.
These are post-it notes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And this is your writing.
Yes, very much so.
And it says GEB. Now that, as I understand it, is the title of a particular set of files.
Yes, I mean, I was trying to work out what that stood for. I suspect it may stand for general blood. It is not ACVSB, it is GEB.
And then we can see you list the volumes, so volume 1 and 2 not relevant, volume 3, 2 extracted. What do you mean by extracted?
I would assume that what that meant was that I have extracted 2 documents from that file, which were not documents that I had in my files. So
that I get the sequence of things right, is this correct? I think your memo to Mrs. James suggested it might be. You first of all went through your own files.
Yes.
You told us yesterday about your files. And then you went through the official files.
Yes.
I want to ask you more about what those were in a moment. But so this is the official files, and
yes.
You're picking out documents that you think are relevant for discovery and which you haven't already got from your own files.
That's correct, yes.
And so I don't think we need to go through each volume, but on the left-hand side of this post-it note, you've written volume 4 missing, and then it looks like it says destroyed.
1989. Now, my reading of that is volume 4 missing, underlined, 1989 underlined. So it's 1989 is the date of that volume. And then I've put down under there as a additional comment, destroyed.
So you couldn't look at volume 4 because your understanding was that it had been destroyed, but you were able to look at volumes 1 to 3 and then 5 to 7, and then if we go back to the first page, 8 through to 14.
Yes.
Now, when you extracted documents, what did you do? Did you copy them and then put them back, or did you leave the files filleted of those documents?
Well, looking at the word I've used there, extracted, that would suggest to me that I would have physically taken the document out of the file and probably put a post-it note or whatever in the file to say, you know, so that I knew roughly where I was. Although having said that, they were all in date order, so that wasn't 100% necessary. And I would have then extracted those, put those to one side, asked my secretary to photocopy them, and then the originals would go back to the file, so the file would have all its originals, and I would have a photocopy, which I could then pass on to Anita James.
Now, in terms of the kind of documents that you found in these files, do you recall whether they were, or what kind of documents they were?
Well, that is actually in that listing which says HCV Discovery 1989 to 1991, that will actually tell you. And by looking at that listing, there were things like scientific papers, there were minutes, and what was quite interesting was that with some of those minutes, it would say annotation. So if a minute had an annotation on it, that was a separate document. And if it had a second annotation, that was yet another document. And if it had a third annotation, that was yet another document. So I tried to do it as thoroughly as I could, so that in essence, when it came to discovery, people could actually see, and quite often, having the 3 documents with the different annotations could be quite informative.
At this stage, when you were looking at the files and taking documents out to copy in the way that you've described for the list and chronology you were building up for Mrs. James, were you considering possible PII, or were you and not taking documents that might be covered by PII?
No, I think the PII concerns came later. I think at that stage I was literally just getting everything out, because I think to have been considering PII would have made it a much more difficult task. It was a difficult enough task anyway, because I think Roger Schofield originally thought it would take a couple of days, but in fact it took a number of weeks to do. Obviously, because I had other work to do at the same time. You know, this wasn't all that I was doing all the time.
Where did you obtain those files from, to the best of your recollection?
From David Burridge, because basically I wouldn't have them because I didn't have the, well, I wouldn't store files. So my understanding is that I must have, now, did I ask him to get the files, or did somebody else tell him to get the files? I or somebody else asked him to get the files, unless, because according to the dockets, they would have been at DRO at that time. If they were in DRO, then presumably David Burridge contacted them and said to them, look, we need these files, could you please send them to us? So the files then turned up in David Burridge's office. Now, I can't recall today, my assumption is that I would have gone to David Burridge's office and I would have said to him, can you give me 2 or 3 of these files? Because obviously I wasn't going to bring along all 14 to my, and I would have taken them to my office, and in my office I would have done the extraction. Having done the extraction, I would then take the files back to David Burridge in his office, and then, or actually, well, this is the other possibility, that I asked my secretary to do the photocopy and I put the original back in the file and then took it, you know, I don't know.
So, again, just so that you can help us with the understanding of the detail, DRO,
Yes.
when you say it had been DRO'd, where physically would that mean they were?
Well, that's probably the Departmental Records Office. That's my guess as to what those initials stand for. And that would have been not on a DH site. That would have, I don't know whether that was in Lancashire or wherever it was. I don't know. It was somewhere not in DH anyway.
So is it your evidence that you had no dealings with DRO?
No, there would have been no reason for me to.
So your dealings were with Mr. Burridge?
Yes.
And you don't know what steps he took or asked to be taken in order to get the GEB files and provide them to you?
Well, presumably I don't know whether he sent them a minute or phoned them or whatever, and he told them what files they wanted. And obviously DRO must have had a good system whereby they could identify the files, and they sent him on to him. Then I looked at them, did my extractions, photocopied them, put back the originals, and then David Burridge presumably would have sent the files back to DRO.
And then if we just look at WITN 4486013, please. These are some of the dockets.
Yes.
And we looked at this during some earlier evidence last year. With volume 4, which is the one that was missing, and we can see
Yes.
the time period it covered, we're told, was 16th of May 89 to 19th of July 1990. And then we have, it's recorded as destroyed on, and then it's not entirely clear, I think, in terms of what the significance of the various dates are. We've got sent to DRO 30th of July 93, then we've got the word destroyed, we've got destroyed on, then we've got a date of the 9th of February 1993, and then we've got dates of what were supposed to be branch review decisions. Now,
Yes, but you see, one of the difficulties for me in reading these dockets is that it says closed file sent to DRO repository on the 9th of February 93, but then on the right-hand side it says sent to DRO 30th of July 93. So I don't know why there are the two dates.
were any of these dockets, first of all, completed by you?
No. Now, when I was, I first became aware of these dockets when I was preparing my statement, my first statement. I'd never, I may well have seen them, but I couldn't recall them. And my guess is that these dockets, as opposed to the other dockets, these dockets would have been either stapled, well, presumably stapled to the front of the individual volume, so that obviously, and my understanding is that where they talk there about branch review decision, which, as I said earlier, is 5 years after the last date on the when the file refers to, and so at some stage the branch review, which presumably would have been David Burridge branch, would have reviewed it, presumably. I mean, that's my guess, because it doesn't say DRO review them, it's the branch review, and presumably decide whether the document can be destroyed or not, or whether it needs a further review. And I think one of them, well, yes, the 1.5 up there actually gives a crossed out the original review date and have put in a different review date for some reason. So I think that, as I say, I cannot recall these. If they were there on the volumes when I had them, I suspect they would have been stapled to the front of the volume.
Did you, if not, first of all, did you cause the destruction of any of these files as far as
No.
you're concerned? Were you consulted by anybody about whether these files should or should not be destroyed?
It would not have been my job to do so.
Can we then look at...
Yeah, can I just,
Yes.
in the light of your worrying about the different dates, suggest an interpretation of the top left-hand quadrant of this screen to you.
Yes.
If you look at each of the 4 dockets,
Yes.
they all have the same date, 9/2/93,
Yes.
of the date when the closed file was sent to the DRO repository.
Yes.
You've told us that your understanding is that there is a 5-year period from the date that the file was finished
Yes.
before it was going to be reviewed.
Yes.
So the 19/7/90 close date
Yes.
would result in 19/7/95. And if you look at each of the other dates,
Yes.
you still have the same exact 5-year period
Yes.
afterwards. Now, in only one of them are there 2 different dates for branch review decision. All the others have a branch review decision which is 5 years on.
Yes.
It might be, might it, that at the top left-hand corner, someone has written destroyed on, and it reads right across.
Yes.
29/9/94.
Yes.
So that looks as though that's the date of destruction.
Yes.
Does that make sense to you as a possible reading?
Well, I think that is the correct, well, from my judgment, that will be the correct reading. But the interesting thing is, I think it's the only docket that actually says destroyed on. I don't think any of the others have any reference to destruction. Not these dockets. The other ones do. The DRO dockets, because there are separate dockets apart from these. But these dockets, that one actually says destroyed on, but I cannot see any of the others that actually, where it's actually said on these dockets, the date of destruction. So I don't know. As I say, it wasn't something that I would have been involved in any shape or form. Now, presumably, somebody from the branch would have filled in the details about when the file starts and when it finishes. Although it's interesting that the writing for the start and the finish seems not to be the same person, or is done at different times. So I don't know. Obviously, there was a system that was worked up, and they're all part of this grouping of GEB1. And I can't really help you any more than that, I'm afraid.
No, it will remain for other evidence, no doubt, to deal with why it should be or why it was that there was a destruction within the 5-year period.
Yes.
Now, just in terms of the entries for branch review decision, there's made by, and then you'll see the stamp GROC, and that's this inquiry's own redaction of signatures. You've appended the unredacted form to your witness statement. Is the signature yours on these dockets?
Which docket?
So these dockets here, if you look at the stamp GROC.
Sorry. Yes.
Which we have.
No, sorry, I wouldn't have been involved in that at all. No.
That's what I wanted to just ask you to confirm. And then you referred to other dockets.
Yes.
If we go to WITN 4486014.
Right.
These are what you describe, I think, in your statement as the DRO dockets.
That's right. The earlier ones I refer to as management dockets, because basically they're actually saying what is actually happening to that particular file, whereas these presumably were generated by DRO, and in fact they're just basically saying this particular volume has been destroyed on such and such a date.
And so we can see that a number of GEB files are destroyed at various dates. We've got 1998 there, 1997. If we go over the page, because these are not, I think, in order. Volume 4, which was the one that was missing when you looked at them, we can see there the date 29th of September 1994 as the date of destruction.
Yeah.
And that appears to be the only file destroyed that early.
Yes.
The others are all destroyed in either 1997 or 1998. Is that your understanding?
Yes, and I would point out also that whereas the management dockets, the earlier ones, I can't say definitely, I may have seen those if they were on the files at the time when I saw the files. I would definitely not have seen these dockets.
And then if we then just go back to your own communications at the time, WITN 4486016. This is you writing to Mrs. James on the 7th of June, and you have explained there that you've gone through all your files, gone through the files made available to me by Mr. Burridge, GEB volumes 1 to 14. Unfortunately, volume 4 for part of 1989 has apparently been destroyed. Mr. Burridge has asked for the individuals responsible to write to him formally confirming this. Did you have any discussions yourself with Mr. Burridge or anybody else that you can recall about what had happened to volume 4?
From the papers that have been made available to me, it doesn't appear that I did, and I assumed that basically I was doing discovery, and discovery is documents you have. Documents you don't have, you can't do discovery of. So therefore, I was highlighting to Mrs. James, and obviously I told Mr. Burridge about this, that there's a file missing. I obviously can't do any discovery on it. And here Mr. Burridge is obviously just checking to make sure that that is indeed the case, that it has been destroyed. Because obviously the management docket saying destroyed, obviously he didn't have that, because that would have been with the volume that was destroyed. And obviously he wouldn't have had the DRO dockets, because they won't presumably have gone back to, I assume they wouldn't have gone back to David Burridge, they would have been kept in a DRO.
Do you have any knowledge as to who authorised or caused the destruction of volume 4?
No, the information I have is literally what is written on that post-it note.
Now, did you, you've flagged up there that volume 4 has apparently been destroyed. Did you put in motion any steps to try and prevent the destruction of any of the other GEB files?
No, in essence, official files had nothing to do with me at all. So therefore, I would not either be contributing to those, I would not be putting papers into those official files, and I would also not be sending off those official files. So I had no responsibility in any shape or form for the official files. That was other individuals. I mean, so David Burridge obviously had the responsibility for putting the papers into the official file. He obviously, or his successors, had the responsibility to send the files to DRO, and I assume what happened was that as the files were filled up, then to prevent his own office being too cluttered, he would have just sent the files off to DRO for safekeeping, and that would have been it. So I would not have been involved.
Did you have any discussions with Mr. Burridge that you can recall about this issue?
I can't recall anything, no.
And then I think the issue came up again in the course of 1996. You've exhibited some of the documents to your first statement. But again, this was in the context of disclosure in relation to hepatitis C litigation. And is this right? A question was raised about going back to the disclosure from the HIV litigation.
Yes.
I don't need to trouble you with the exchange of views about whether that was a worthwhile exercise or not. But is this your understanding that it seemed to come to light that there was some material missing from the HIV litigation disclosure?
Reading the papers that have been given to me, yes, it appears that that was the case. That in essence, I think what the feeling was, particularly when it came to, the writs about haemophilia patients, then the HIV litigation, which obviously contained a lot of documents relating to hepatitis C, that those documents that were listed in the HIV discovery should be then considered for discovery in HCV litigation against haemophilia, again, brought on by solicitors acting for haemophilia patients.
Now, after you left the department, there was an internal investigation or audit as to what had happened to the GEB files, because not only by then had volume 4 been destroyed, but also, as we saw from the dockets, a number of the other remaining volumes had been destroyed. and you've seen, I think, a minute from
Yes.
in 2000 suggesting that there should be this inquiry investigation process and that a number of people should be contacted, including yourself.
Yes.
Were you contacted for the purposes of that internal audit?
No, I mean, say the first time I became aware of that audit report was when I was preparing the documents for my first statement.
And can we just then look at that internal audit report? And Paul, can we have DHSC 5087801?
Do you want to give the number again?
DHSC, actually this doesn't look right, 5087801. Yes. This right, no? Mr. Hosking, who is the guru of documents, tells me that's correct. If not, we have it in an unredacted format, but I'd rather look at it in, in a redacted format. I'd rather look at it in the unredacted format. Brilliant. Now, others will speak to the detail of this internal audit process. I just want to ask you about what's said about you at paragraph 4.7. So this is page 6, please. So it says 4.7, 2 questions remain unanswered from our review. Once the department was aware it would need to collect relevant documentation together, Dr. Rejman, who provided the secretariat role for the ACVSB and who had previous experience of non-party discovery, began the process of collecting information. This was in 1994. However, Dr. Rejman did not recall the ACVSB files from DRO, extracting information instead from other policy files. Some of the ACVSB files were still available, unrecalled, as late as 1997 and 1998, therefore. Dr. Rejman retired in 1994, which obviously I think is incorrect, as part of the FMR, and we do not know why the ACVSB files available at DRO were not recalled. Do you have any observations about that paragraph?
Yes, I've gone into it in some detail in my first statement. Right, the errors, one of the problems was, as you say, I think it was Marilyn Morgan that suggested that Dr. Metters and I should be interviewed as part of this internal audit. I don't know whether Dr. Metters was interviewed, although there's no reference to an interview with Dr. Metters in this report, but I definitely wasn't interviewed. And I think that is the reason why so many errors have crept into this report. Right, okay, yes, it is correct I provided the secretariat role for ACVSB. No, it is incorrect that I had previous experience of non-party discovery. No, it is incorrect I did not do the process of collecting information in 1994. There was no reason why I should recall ACVSB files from DRO, and I did actually obtain that information from the ACVSB files and not from other policy files. And I did not retire in 1994 as part of the Functions and Manpower Review, so there are several errors in that paragraph.
And then, can I ask you then, finally, on this, to look at the statement of Mrs. James, just one paragraph. So it's WITN 5426001, please. And if we could go to... sorry, give me a moment, Paul. I think it's page 100. paragraph 6.32. I wanted to pick it up about a third of the way down now, down that paragraph. It says, I can see from the audit report that some of the volumes were destroyed after June 1995. That is to say, after Mr. Burridge, Dr. Rejman and I had been alerted to the destruction of volume 4. That is why I've made clear above, I don't think we need to look at the other passage, that between us we should have ensured that a clear message was delivered that such files obviously be retained / marked for lengthier retention. Now, do you agree, leave aside for a moment the question of which individual should have done this, do you agree that once it became apparent to the department in 1995 that volume 4 had been destroyed when it shouldn't have been, that steps should have been taken to send that clear message which would have prevented the destruction of the remaining GEB files?
Well, I think that somebody, and I presume in this case it would have been David Burridge, when he was asking about has volume 4 actually been destroyed, it is possible, I don't know, there's no evidence to this, but David Burridge was quite a conscientious individual, and I would have thought, you know, my guess is that he may well have said to the person he spoke to, look, you know, we really don't want our files destroyed, particularly not before their review date, which I think was the crucial point with that file, that it was before the review date that it was destroyed. And I assume that he may well have said to the person he spoke to, could you make sure that our files are kept at least to the review date, and that when the review date comes up, please contact us so that we can decide whether they need further retention. I mean, so as I say, David Burridge is a conscientious individual. I would not be surprised if that is what he did. The difficulty is he may well have said that to an individual, but where that went from then on, who's to know? That is always the difficulty.
You were well placed to appreciate that these were potentially important files.
Well,
should you have done something about it?
Basically, I mean, say in my report there, I said that had I had any indication that there was a possibility of these files being destroyed, I would definitely have said, look, these files are relevant and important and should not be destroyed. But looking at the files that I had in May, June 1995, I assume that there was nothing in those files saying that this file is likely to be destroyed, because if the only docket that was on there was a review date, then I would have assumed review date is what that means. That means somebody makes a review on that date.
So those are the questions I'm proposing to ask Dr. Rejman, but we do now need obviously to afford an opportunity to call participants to suggest further questions arising out of Dr. Rejman's evidence. I'm afraid I think I'll certainly need half an hour, if not a little longer. So could I say 5:15?
Yes, well, shall we say not before
Thank you.
5:15? Yes. So not before 5:15 and as soon as possible, obviously, thereafter.
Thank you.